In glass, there's an urgency to it that is not in your control. You can't step away and make some decisions. It locks you into a moment, and the material captures every decision that you make.
The first time I saw your work, and I'm like, how does that get transported?
That is the correct question. All of those decisions are based on whether or not it will survive shipping. So all of those decisions happen before I make one component. I had to come to terms with what is going to happen if this object disintegrates in the museum, in the public view.
Welcome back to the Installation Art Podcast, the world's #1 and only podcast about installation art and the people who work with it. This show is dedicated primarily to discussing the unique joys and challenges of the medium and uncovering stories from behind the scenes. I am your host, Anastasia Parmson. In today's episode, we're having a crack at a material you wouldn't necessarily think of when picturing large-scale installations. My guest is American artist Beth Lipman, based in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin. She creates still life sculptures and installations that are overflowing with minute details, and her primary material is glass. Beth makes more traditional vessels such as goblets or jugs, alongside elaborate sculptures, objects, furniture pieces, and even wall art. Yes, all in glass. Her work has been acquired by many important collections and recognized with public commissions, grants, and residencies all over the United States and internationally. Prepare to be blown away. Here's my conversation with Beth Lipman. Thanks for coming, Beth. I really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, I'm thrilled to meet you via Zoom. Thanks for thinking of me. Yeah.
As soon as I saw your work, I was like, what? How? I need to know more.
I think we have a lot in common, actually, you and I.
Oh.
If you don't mind me saying so. But the premise of your installation work, rooted in drawing, is not so dissimilar than, it's very close to my heart and my method, right? So when I saw your work, I was like, oh, yeah, okay. We're doing this.
Love to hear that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I can't wait to learn more.
Me too.
How about we start with some easy, funny questions just to get things rolling. You said you're a podcast addict.
Yes.
What's some of your favorite podcasts to listen to while working?
Oh, I love that question. Lately, I have tried to cut down a little bit on my current event political podcasts because here in the United States, as you know, we're in a major election year. And so I am trying to conserve my health as long as possible, my mental health. I faithfully listen to The Daily, which is put out by the New York Times. I listen to multiple podcasts from The Bulwark, which is this really phenomenal group of activists and thinkers. I have cut down on that just a tiny bit. I'm sure they'll understand because I'm pacing myself for this year. But I do really love the radio hour for The New Yorker. I love history also. I love listening to books. And then I also listen to music. So it really depends on what I'm doing and whether or not I need to think or if it's just rote practice, rote kind of process that I'm doing. That's going to determine what I'm listening to. Sometimes I don't listen to anything, but I do really enjoy listening to things while I work. What about you?
I love listening to art podcasts, actually. I mean, I used to do the daily and a few more opinionated people.
Yeah.
But during COVID, I had to stop. I was getting too anxious about
Yeah.
it. So I don't listen to that stuff anymore. Since I started doing the podcast, I've had way less time to listen to other people's.
Sure.
But on a road trip, my favorite is How I Built This with Guy Raz. It's about founders, how people started companies.
Oh, I am
Very
totally going to look at that.
Do you have a favorite quote?
No, I have a mantra that I have been repeating since the beginning of the year, which is basically just surrender. That's it. I do read pretty voraciously, but even if I love a quote, if I don't write it down or keep it somewhere, it goes out to make room for other things, you know?
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. We're saturated, right? We don't.
My brain is a sieve.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right. But it's also that we're so saturated. We're living in this time of extreme fire hose of information if you want it. So half the time I think, am I losing my memory? And the other half of the time I think, this is normal. No one is supposed to process this amount of information. We might have to talk to a scientist about that.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that we are just, our brains cannot keep more than the requisite burners going at one time.
That's what I tell myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay.
I've decided to give myself a lot of grace on that and said to myself, well, look at all the things you've done and experienced and the people you've met. How on earth are you supposed to keep all of that in your brain, you know?
Right. You have a large world.
Yeah.
So, I mean, really, it's a survival mechanism. That's what I tell myself.
Yep. Let's say that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
What's your favorite beverage in the studio?
I like a good seltzer. Topo Chico. We're going to say Topo Chico. The non-alcoholic Topo Chico. It's a violent seltzer. It's pretty violent.
Sounds interesting. And if you weren't an artist, what would you be?
You know, I thought about this question because I listened to some of the other podcasts that you've done. So I feel like I had to prepare myself a little bit. I think it would be a historian or a librarian. One of those two things.
Librarian was definitely on my list at some point.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Seemed like a great job when I was in high school.
Yeah. And I still love books. I love hard copy books. I love the potential of finding something in the stacks. And it is a motivating force for me in bookstores and libraries in a way that technology doesn't really do it for me. You know, when you're researching online, it's faster, but I don't know. It's not magical, really, in the same way.
Okay, Beth, let's get into it and go back to the roots. Tell me about where did you grow up and were you a creative kid?
Okay. I grew up primarily in Pennsylvania, East Coast of the United States. And my mother was essentially a self-taught artist. She took some extracurricular art classes and craft classes. And so I was always surrounded by her making products, basically, to sell and exploring things. And my grandmother was also very creative. She never called herself an artist. She called herself a sewing technician, but she did all things, you know, like crewing, embroidery. She would make her own patterns and make her own clothes and make her children's clothes. So I naturally just was doing things. I didn't have to justify the process of making anything or experimenting with materials and I'm an only child. So I just occupied myself a lot. So I was either kind of helping my grandmother or my mother, or I was shut in my room reading or drawing, that kind of thing. So yeah, I was creative. Yep.
Is there something in your childhood that you remember that had a significant impact on you as an artist today?
I think my whole childhood, from a period of time on, from maybe when I was 8 on, I was helping my mother with her art that she was making to sell. So she made like folk art that she would sell limited edition to department stores or candy stores. So she did wholesale and retail. She did the New York Gift Fair in New York City. And so at some point, probably while I was holding a tent pole in a thunderstorm at Fordham University in New York City, trying to keep the tent from blowing away during a craft fair, I really think I had a definitive moment where I said, I do not want to earn a living doing this. This is not how I want to make things and be an artist in the world. Because I was a crafts child. I was immersed in this weird, almost counterculture in the 80s. There was this revivalist kind of course, it was, magical thinking, wasn't it? It was just like a revivalist kind of colonial aesthetic that had gripped the deck arts and the domestic arts in the United States. And there were, generations of people that earned a living making new things that looked old or antiqued, that were triggering this whole, it wasn't Victorian, but it had some semblances of like this Victorian deck arts, like revivalist moment, this kind of like amassing of this countrified, neo-colonial decorative arts aesthetic. And I just wanted to get away from it.
So you had a moment where you're like, this is not the kind of art I want to make.
I just didn't want to be, possibly electrocuted holding a metal pole during a thunderstorm in a craft fair in New York City ever again. You know what I mean? That was like a defining moment for me where I was like, this won't do. I want something else, But I never, it didn't kill art for me. Like all the great things about making were left intact. It was just that manifestation of industry around a creative process was something that was like deeply uninteresting to me when I was able to contextualize it as a young person.
Did you have any knowledge of contemporary art when you were young, in your teens?
I did, but I don't know. I mean, this is the great thing that I will say about growing up with my mother in particular, is that there was never any kind of labeling, right? Of this is this kind of art, this is this kind of art, this is craft, this is contemporary, this is historical. I'm doing a lot of gesturing here for the audience, even though they can't see me. I'm using my hands a lot. So that definition, all of those definitions around art and their assumed hierarchies, that was totally not in my realm at all, because my mother was hungry to understand culture and art, and she was inspired by art. So she would take me to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Smithsonian's, like all the East Coast major museums. And she never said, this is contemporary art, this is medieval art, this is decorative art, this is craft, this is folk art, what it was called back then, folk art, which it still is in some circles. But, I think that fluidity was, I didn't realize how rigid those labels could be. At that time, I just kind of soaked in everything as it was coming at me.
I feel like that's reflected in your work today as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I never said I want to be a contemporary artist and because I saw, this artist who was contemporary at that time making, it was never a moment like that. It was all just like this merging of everything, right?
But was there a moment where you decided, I want to be an artist?
I don't remember that moment, if I had a moment like that. I do know that when I was in 4th grade and I had to fill out a form that asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, one of the answers was artist, and the other was veterinarian, and the other was soccer player. So that is the earliest evidence that I wanted to be an artist was in 4th grade. But I really didn't have a defining moment that I could recall.
But you went to study art, is that correct?
I did, yes. I studied at Mass College of Art in Boston, Massachusetts, and then I transferred to Tyler School of Art, Temple University in Philadelphia, and I did a double major in glass and fibers in both of those institutions. I don't have an MFA. I only have a BFA. I was a long-term BFAer. I was in school for almost 6 years. But yeah, that's my formal education, we'll say.
Do you remember what led you to decide to go for glass, studying glass?
Yeah. So I went to a summer camp called Horizons in Western Massachusetts. It was an art camp for teenagers, and I took drawing and textiles 1 year, and then I took textiles and glass the second year. And then I knew that was a moment where I did know I want to study both of these materials in depth. I kind of fell in love with the process of both of those ways of working.
Now tell me how, so you're studying glass. I'm assuming you're learning a lot of techniques in what it takes to make different kinds of glass works. What then leads you to starting to make installations with glass, to make these accumulations and large sculptures?
Yeah. It takes a bit of time to get a handle on the process of making things in that material. And so I would say that the process definitely informed the ideas, but also the process of working in fibers informed the way I worked in glass. So this idea of accumulation as opposed to a subtraction was something that I think intuitively just unfolded in the practice. So I went from making objects that were related to the body. I was deeply influenced by Magdalena Abacanovich, actually, in school. And so I started making glass things that were kind of conceptual adornments for the body. And from there, I started to think about the components as a way of drawing in the space, which maybe you can relate to in terms of your work, where I wanted to have larger drawings that could be immersive in the space and really be something that the viewer could engage in with their entire body as opposed to just a single object. And the only way to do that was to really just start accumulating parts. And in 2000, I was living in New York. I was living in Brooklyn. and I was invited to be in an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And I could choose anything in their collection and respond to it. And I gravitated right to a still life painting because I had been surrounded by still life paintings because of the way that my mother worked in my entire childhood was about this folk art aesthetic. And still life really is such a fluid genre that it like sneaks into folk art. It sneaks into the art canon with portraiture and genre. So I knew there was something within that tradition that I wanted to explore and kind of explode out. And that was the first opportunity that I had. And it was a really very intuitive kind of reaction to, it was called Still Life with Fruit, and it was by a German-American artist named Severin Rosen, who is getting a little revival right now, actually. A lot of people forgot about him for a long time. So I just started kind of almost a response work to that painting without fully understanding exactly what I was doing at that time, which I think I run with scissors towards the unknown. It's really, really important in my work. So I'm not really that interested in fully just executing something that I completely understand. There's virtually nothing there for me. So if there's, I get really very kind of clued into, it's almost an itch, right? Or something. Do you know what I'm saying? There's something, the hook, where there's something and you can't verbalize it necessarily or intellectualize it even, but there's something. And then you have to follow that. It's almost a leap of faith or something.
So you start making.
Yes. And then over a period of time, then I start to intellectualize it, analyze it, understand it. And that's the building that happens that manifests into bigger moments, I think. And now I will say that the larger scale works, they're usually very specific to at least the space, if not the history of the site or the demographics or the culture in some way. But I have to be in a space in order to understand what I'm going to do in that space. So the space informs the final scale and how the work interacts with the space and what it's communicating to the viewer.
So your work really is site-specific.
Yes. I mean, it can live outside of that specific zone, and I do create work that can transcend those moments, but not always. Sometimes it's really locked into something site-specific. Can I ask you a question, Anastasia? Okay, so you're creating almost like your romanticized notion of a space that is, how does that work for you? Because you're starting almost from from my understanding, you're starting from an opposite intention in creating the spaces that you create. Is that true?
Well, the space I create is like a revision of my childhood home, I guess. So there's a lot of elements that are real and existed or are kind of symbols of something that I used to live and experience. But then there's also a buildup of aspirational elements, like making it better.
I love that. And that's like very inner circle kind of negotiation that you're having in your practice, right? These moments where you're inserting things that are aspirational versus accurate, like this whole understanding of authenticity. And then you've created something that is its authentic self. in itself after you've created it. So you've almost obliterated that blend that happens, right? Because you've manifested the actual space in some ways.
Yeah. I guess for me, I don't really talk about my references specifically. I'm not like, this is here because of XYZ and this was my this and that, you know. So the final product isn't really any more linked to the past. It's only for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of an opening for other people, to the viewers, to find their own story in it.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating.
Hopefully, anyway.
Yeah.
Hey, this is a quick intermission to let you know that this podcast is also available on YouTube. So you can go and see the guests' facial expressions, gesturing, and maybe some images of their work. Okay, I have to admit that my knowledge of working with glass is limited to what I've seen on that Netflix show, Blown Away. And it looks really hard. Can you tell me a bit about the particularities and the challenges of working with that material to make this multitude or these large pieces that you do compared to some other material?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Blown Away, huh? I think a lot of people probably understand the material by watching that show. And as with all aspects of life, right, it's accurate and it's wildly inaccurate at the same time. My life is not that dramatic in the studio every day. I mean, it is. This is what I can say that I think has so much potential conceptually that keeps me working in the material, and that is the time. It is a time-based process, which for me directly relates to the genre of still life. And so you're really embodying this memento mori in making the work, because there's always a beginning. And of course, there always is, right? There's always a beginning, a middle, and an end to making things. But in glass, there's an urgency to it that is not in your control. It really has to do with the way that things are made. So you can't step away always and make some decisions, go to the bathroom, smoke a cigarette, look at Instagram, whatever you're going to do. Of those things, I probably would only go to the bathroom if I were to step away. But, you really have to see it through to the end. It locks you into a moment. And then the material captures every decision that you make. Every mark that you make is revealed in the material. So it is a record of you or the team you're working with or another person that's making things with you. It's a record of that time with their skills, their focus or distraction, their physical, whatever physical's going on in their bodies that day, or mental, whatever. It is a milestone right there. And it's really distorted in Blown Away, I'll tell you, because of course everything has to fit into that format. But in terms of negotiating material, I think that it gives like kind of a bird's eye view into the fact that that's a thing in that material. Now, there's other things like durational work, Marina Abramovic's work, or weaving or drawing, if you're doing your drawing. I mean, there's ways that we're marking moments in time, but every material has its own structure that you can then break out of or embrace. You can choose to relinquish control or choose to hold tightly to control. But I use very traditional techniques in non-traditional ways, essentially. I'm really interested in being as direct as possible in getting to the end result. I don't identify as a maker, but I don't really identify as a perfectionist, an artisan. I really am more interested in that expression in whatever material I'm working in, not just glass. It's a very painterly concept, actually, right? The first mark, best mark kind of thing. Like, I don't want to belabor something. I want to keep the spontaneity in the components because I think that manifests in the energy of the overall work in the end.
Interesting you say that, because your work looks very, well, for me at least, it looks very clean, very technically precise. If there's any kind of flaws or blobs, they look intentional.
Well, they are intentional, right? But they're not necessarily defined by classical concerns. And if you look very closely, you will see a lot of flaws, but I need the flaws to really bring your attention to the perfection as well. And I work with, I should say, and I'm interested in whether you do this or not also, but I do work with a lot of other people. So I do make some things in my own studio, and then I also work with others. I also work in industry because the work just takes so much to make. It takes time, and it takes facilities that I don't have sometimes, and it also takes skill sets that I don't have sometimes. So I do what I do rather well, and then I work with others who do other things rather well. And so it's this negotiation where I'm kind of almost like being a choreographer as well as, it is like that, actually. We can say that.
A conductor.
Yeah.
So you collaborate with other people and you outsource sometimes some of the things that you're not as skilled in.
Yes, or that I just don't have time to make in my own studio because I only have these hands. And I'm also a mother, and I'm also helping to take care of my dad. So I remember when my daughters started school and I thought, oh my God, I have all day. I have all day in the studio. And now I have like the smallest amount of time while they're in school. I don't know how that time collapsed so thoroughly, but it's like I just don't have enough time to make these very large scale works by myself. And also, it's really interesting to work with other people. It's a larger vocabulary to work with other people. So I can move more rapidly through my ideas. And also there's things that happen that would never have happened if it was just my own hands in one studio making things.
How do you seek out those collaborations? How do they come about?
Sometimes they're offered in the case of a residency. This way of working in this material, it's a pretty small community. You've got great artists in Australia as well that are working in glass, and I know a bunch of them. So it's a pretty amazing community, and we all need each other. I mean, it's very rare that you find people working in this material and they're just in their own studio with the doors shut and never go out into the world. And I think that is probably a similarity for installation artists, right? Like what we do a lot of times, we are dependent on just a lot of warm bodies to come help get something done or make something happen. And that's pretty special, I think.
Mm-hmm. I would say so far from my interviews, it's kind of been 50-50. There are still a lot of people who really like to be alone, doing their own thing, building everything.
Are you one of those people?
I've been doing stuff by myself mostly, but that's probably more because I haven't known how to go about it any other way, and now I'm putting my feelers out to try and change that, actually.
It's definitely a different way of working in that you need to be really 2 or 3 steps ahead of whatever the process is in order to bring other people into the practice. And I don't, I need alone time for conceptualizing and doing research. So I'm not constantly out in the world, but when it comes to fabricating, I just started a project where I'm fabricating with an old friend of mine, someone that I met in the early O's, and I knew that he was a fabulous metal fabricator. For the last 20 years, I've known that he's there doing his thing, working with other artists, and I finally had an opportunity to make something that I thought, oh, this is perfect. I can work with Matt Crane now. So, yeah, I think that's how these relationships work, is just building tiny little moments over a long period of time and kind of seeing potential there, right? And also sometimes it's just complete luck of the draw.
Can you give me an example of a collaboration that led to something where you changed your perspective or you changed your project?
I mean, I think that happens all the time. Actually. Yeah, because, I mean, it happens as long as the project has the capacity for change. So the other artists that I work with know what they know, and they've been doing it for 20 or 30 years. And so they have an understanding of what can be done with the process that I've come to them to work on a project with. Sometimes I need to problem solve certain aspects of something, and I don't know how to do it because I don't understand the process. Other times, there's suggestions that happen, and I just try to remain open and not close myself off, because I am interested in what those other people have to say. But I also, it's interesting. It's a dance. It really is like a dance in some way. You're negotiating where it's your idea. You need help. You need help fabricating something or facilitating something. And so the check-in happens in so far as, does this new way of thinking about the process further the idea? Or is it something that pivots or detours away from a core aspect of the idea? And those are the things that allow me to kind of swim through the negotiation of working with other artists who have their own really vibrant practices at the same time. But I think understanding and being able to define in those moments helps you move forward too. This is actually what I want. Perhaps I didn't know this is exactly what I wanted because I wasn't confronted about changing it, but this is why I want it this way. Or if we do it this other way, it is going to make the piece better and more effective for sure. But it's just like opening the box of paints and having a broader palette than you ever thought you. This is what I will say is that, for instance, I work with a man named Jordan Smith, who is this master scientific lab worker, and he can make things in glass that are just impossible in my own studio. I mean, he can make 10-foot long objects turned on a lathe. And the moment that I knew that he could do that was the moment I started thinking about making 10-foot long objects that are turned on a lathe. Like, I just absorbed, like, this person is willing to work with me and they can do something I can't do. And that means that this other thing is possible, right? There's always this hope for discovery that you're going to discover something that's going to blow your mind and open it up again.
Are you always working just making stuff, or are you more project-based?
Yes, to both of those things. So I usually have some studio works going in my practice, and it's a way that I can move through ideas, like some core ideas that keep coming back in my practice over and over again. And then I've been fortunate enough to have, over the last 5 to 10 years, pretty involved large-scale projects that are taking several years to manifest. And so in my ideal world, I have both things going on, but I will also say that of late, I'm really interested in just, it sounds bizarre in some ways, but I'm not concerned with the level of output. I am not just rushing in to just make whatever. I mean, I am driven to make, but the rhythm has changed. It's slowed. Sometimes it speeds up, but I'm driven to be invested in the work, but not just to make, the whole ecological footprint of what I'm doing is just forefront in my mind all the time. So I'm not just feeding the beast, making sure I'm constantly making things, especially in glass. Like, I really am taking a lot of time to make sure that the work has to be made before it gets made because of my accountability as a human at this point.
Yeah, I really feel that.
You do too, right? So how do you negotiate that in your practice?
It's hard, but I'm also very project-based. I don't sit around doodling and drawing just because I have to. I channel my creativity in other ways during the off-peak periods. And, like with making large installations as an independent artist, space is a huge consideration. Storage,
it's
all
huge.
Of those things.
It's huge.
So, yeah, you have to take all of that into account.
So do you have a lot of storage spaces? I mean, do you store things?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like a graveyard of black and white works. It's a little cage in a garage, and it's a little depressing. And I'm always glad when I can go and get stuff out and be like, you're going to an exhibition. Yay.
Nice.
Yeah, that's what it's like.
Yep. Yep.
Can you tell me, you have these works that are like tables laid and overflowing. There's things precariously stacked. Are they all in one piece, or are they all separate elements that are carefully stacked together?
They are separate elements for the most part. Some things are small clusters of objects, and all of those decisions are based on whether or not it will survive shipping. Every single decision. So all of those decisions happen before I make one component.
Yeah, I have to admit, the first time I saw your work, and I'm like, how does that get transported?
Yeah. That is the correct question. That's the correct question. Yeah. So it is a surprisingly durable material. Those questions, though, the questions of either failure or destruction become conceptual in the work. So there are times that I deliberately make things that I have no idea whether or not it will survive. And that kind of latent potential failure or destruction or death is something that activates the work in a way that is really intriguing and to me that I invest in. Those questions, as you know, they're so tied to human condition, life cycle stuff. So I rest in those questions a lot, not from an art handling standpoint necessarily, but from a conceptual standpoint. And a lot of times those particular components manifest as pieces of furniture that, as you know, are directly related to the body. So I create environments where there are natural cycles that can happen that I am not in control of. I know that probably didn't answer your question, though, did it? So that's maybe not what you were asking, but
do you have any particularly memorable story regarding the transport or installation of your work?
So case in point, in 2008, I had a large-scale installation at the RISD Museum in Providence, Rhode Island, on the East Coast of the United States. And I made a piece of furniture, a love seat, that was made in sections and that I knew I would have to assemble on site because there was really no way that I was aware of to ship something like that. It was just a fully glass, large-scale, like a life-size love seat that was referring to a permanent collection object in the RISD Museum's collection. I thought that was probably the first time I did that. And I did not know when I assembled it on site. The exhibition was up for 4 months, I think. I didn't know whether or not the love seat would actually hold up under its own weight or not. And I had to come to terms with what is going to happen if this object disintegrates in the museum, in the public view. And that was one of the first times that I had to walk through that process of negotiating, like, well, why would it matter if it cracked and broke under its own weight? Why would that be less interesting than if it actually retained its intended form? So long story long, but it did. It held up for the duration of the exhibition, but it cracked shortly after, I think within a year. I ended up offering it to the museum because I knew that I couldn't take it away. I would have to destroy it. They decided to acquire it. And a year later, I think they contacted me and they said, there's this crack that formed. And I said, yep. And so we had a discussion. How do you approach what is the right way of healing, I'm air quoting here, healing this event? And is it a repair? Is it something that it's reincarnated? Is it something that is destroyed in its entirety and is allowed to disintegrate? And those questions became really very profound in some ways for me.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It's kind of interesting, I'm glad you think so. It was interesting for me as well. In the end, they ended up kind of building this plexiglass crutch system that held the love seat aloft and kind of relieved the tension from where it was trying to split apart.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I would imagine that things breaking is just a normal part of your work.
It's true. It's more of a question of the intention behind the break. Am I intentionally destroying something? Or am I incorporating an accidental break? Something rolls off the table and falls and breaks. But I find those moments to be really important in the entire dialogue of the composition. So I really don't throw anything away. Everything has a place and everything is waiting. It has like this potential for engagement.
Do you reuse elements of an installation in a future work? What happens to the work after an exhibition is over?
I do occasionally reuse things. I have compositions that exist in my storage unit. Sound familiar? And I will keep that work and iterate that same work again, and every object is generally in the same place in the composition, but it's always a little different. It's really an alive drawing because every time I reassemble it, it's just marginally different. And if something breaks in the trajectory of exhibiting the work over a period of years or whatever, all of those moments are decisions for me. Is the object more powerful having been broken to incorporate it back into the composition? Does it need to be remade? And is that broken object, does it have a life somewhere else? I generally like to be very transparent and allow the lifespan of the work to basically be the lifespan of the work and not dictate because something is broken, it's not valuable anymore. Of course, it is valuable. It may be even more valuable because it was broken, right? Once again, all these things going back to the human condition. So if something is around for a long enough period of time, sometimes I cannibalize it and just dissipate, the work is over and I'll use the components for something else, or sometimes I melt the material back and recreate something new. So it's like a lot of reincarnation that happens in the work in that way.
Do people tend to want to touch your stuff?
I think most times they like to not even get remotely near it. It terrifies them, a lot of people.
Why do you think that is?
I think the stigma around the material is so great, and there's usually things that look broken or are broken, and they don't want to be held accountable for the perceived event that they had nothing to do with. So it really turns the viewer back on themselves sometimes. Are your pieces occasionally performative? I know I've saw images of people engaging in the interiors. Are they always performative, or are they meant to not be touched?
I have, for example, chairs that people can sit in, and that's fine in the way they're made. But the problem is once you have one element that's interactive, people think it's a free-for-all for the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so I would like to move away from having that. Yeah. I would like it to be look but not touch kind of work. And I think maybe that's not possible because it is very, I guess, curious for people. They want to know what it is. They can't tell what the material is. They have to touch it to figure it out. People think it's paper, which I guess I kind of make it look like paper intentionally with the kind of paint I use. But yeah, I haven't cracked that one yet. But I think really if people are touching my stuff and it's getting damaged, then it's on me in the way I've presented it, really, more than anything else.
So the question is how to create something completely immersive that allows people to come home, literally come into the home without all of the messy parts of human everything, dirt, hair, oil, all of the stuff, right? I have to say that your work is so... I got really excited when I saw it because the drawing, for me, automatically punted me into this quintessential essence of space and home. And you did it with lines and white paint. And I do that with clear glass. I want you to see the form of a vessel, a drinking cup, and understand and deeply know what that object is. And then you're literally seeing through it and going beyond what you're seeing. And your drawing does that for me. I'm a little jelly about that, because I was like, that, that is really like, that's an elemental, to me, that's like, I empathize with. Anyway, that's what it does for me. Perhaps that's not what you are wanting. And perhaps that's why I see that, is because I relate to that in what I'm doing with my work. But perhaps it's not that at all for you. But that's what it does for me, is I was like, wow, you've done that. You've done that in an even more elegant way. Is that what you're trying to do?
Thank you for saying that. I love that. It's not necessarily, it's just that I think that kind of presentation is very familiar, because everybody understands drawing with lines, like doodles, sketches. Everybody's done it at some point. And so, yeah, I really do love that. The way I draw, when you're up close, when I'm doing it, it's almost abstract.
Mm-hmm.
But then you step back and these random, squiggly, faulty, imperfect lines just form this image that is instantly recognizable. Even I think that's just crazy.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, like the tools that we're using kind of as a hook or an engagement with the viewer. Like, you've found a way to do that with line drawing, and I'm doing something different with glass, a quality of glass. But I think the work that really is viscerally successful to the viewer always has something like that. That is a courtship. It's a courtship in a way that you're communicating with the viewer.
It's kind of, for me, it's like a juxtaposition or like a coexistence of something that's familiar, instantly recognizable, maybe nostalgic, but also a form that's curious or unexpected, or you're not sure what it is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's slippage there. There's a slippage.
Speaking of the audience and how they experience your work, what would you like people to take away from experiencing your work?
There's not one thing that I would like people to experience in looking at my work. To me, I have very specific ideas, and the more I give the viewer, in some ways, the less interesting it is for me to engage with the viewer. I do think there's spectacle. I use the idea of spectacle to court the viewer to come into the work. The primary concerns within the work are really the kind of, the work is a demarcation of being human, right? At this moment in time in the Earth's cycle. And the enormity of that just is something that drives my work. And there's a lot of terror and horror in that. And then there's also extreme beauty and ephemerality and temporality within that. So I would like the viewer to have a visceral reaction that brings them into a more contemplative space that deals with temporality, vanitas, mortality. Obviously, vanitas and mortality are the same thing. Maybe, recognize aspects of themselves within the chaos of the composition, either within or without. Yeah, a certain amount of recognition.
So it's a lot about memento mori.
Yes. And also just the subjective gaze, right? Like the view as a human in this world. And identity, larger than just, it's really a deep time identity. It's really about the human species for me. And I use objects really to talk about what kind of footprint we leave on the planet after we're gone a little bit. So I'm really inserting a lot of vocabulary that I am familiar with that comes from my world. I'm not trying to represent everyone on the planet. I'm just representing myself in that way.
Are you always the one installing your work in person?
Not always. The larger scale work, I usually am on site. During COVID, I had the pleasure to Zoom a 5-week solo exhibition at the Museum of Art and Design in New York City. That was challenging, I think, for everyone. It's just more efficient if I am on site, we'll say. It can certainly be done without me, but it's just much, much more efficient if I'm there, for sure.
I need to ask you, you have done these incredible pieces that are almost like glass wallpaper or like wall drawings with glass pieces. How are they attached to the wall?
I just use silicone. I just use the smallest amount of silicone and I tape them in place. And then when it comes time for the installation to be removed, I use a palette knife and cut through the silicone between the glass and the wall, and then I can use it again. So silicone becomes my primary agent of installation because it's flexible. You can remove it and reinstall with it, and it is incredibly strong.
Love that.
Yeah. Pro tip.
What are you like on install day?
I'm usually hyper-focused, usually quite caffeinated and excited.
What do you do when things aren't working as you planned? Do you have a plan B? How do you roll with it?
Well, as you know, we're really adaptive. We're super adaptive people. So I try to always know what all of the variables are before installation day. If I've done my job correctly, which I have to date done my job correctly, I have anticipated every possible issue that could arise and have a way of solving that before I get to the museum with a crew of people to install with me. And to date, that has been pretty effective. So the plan B, what is the plan B? I would say there is no plan B. It's pretty much sorted, because the work is so fragile. There's just not really a lot of room for winging it at any moment. Like, right now I'm fabricating an outdoor sculpture in bronze and glass. I'm working with an object conservator. I'm working with a structural engineer. I'm working with a metal fabricator. I'm working with other glass fabricators. I'm working with the university, Iowa State University. So, yes, things always go awry, but I'm pretty tight about things that are either permanent or semi-permanent and are potentially hazardous to the general public. I do not mess around with that at all. It's all wrapped up with a shiny bow on those pieces. Mm-hmm. Things hanging above people's heads, that kind of thing,
Do you build in the lighting into your installation well ahead of time? Do you know exactly where the light's going to be, how it's going to work?
Yes, I do. Even to the extent that maybe the lighting has to be completely finished before the installation happens. Not always, but a lot of times that's the case because you don't want a genie or a scissor lift going up and over a piece once it's on view, ever.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you sometimes rock up with your own lighting solutions?
I usually have a lighting discussion that is either facilitated by the institution or there's a suggestion. A lot of institutions have lighting designers, and they're usually pretty amazing at what they do. So those conversations happen like months ahead of showing up. Even like the tone, all of that. What happens at night versus day, all of it. Mm-hmm.
Great. Love that. How long does it take you from start to finish? I'm talking just the fabrication to make one of those tables laden. Do you also make the tables yourself?
Yeah, I design them and they are custom built. I rarely use found objects unless I want to incorporate the inherent history of that object and everything it connotes into the final sculpture. And even so, when I'm creating furniture or objects, I'm always really aware of what history I might be referencing, even if it's a new object, right? So that's really important. All the material culture stuff is really, really important to me within the work. So a larger scale sculpture, usually from start to finish, it takes me a minimum of a year. Sometimes it takes longer. So a lot of times I'm working like several years out. Right now, I'm working on 2 large-scale pieces, and I've been working on them consistently since last year. And one of them is due to be installed in the fall at Muskegon Museum of Art in Michigan. But that, that's been in dialogue for years, really.
Wow. Yeah, that's a long lead time. How do you approach the commercial aspect of your work? Do you sell those big installations?
So I do work with galleries. I am represented by 4 different galleries. My primary gallery is Nora Jaime Gallery in New York. At this point, I almost always am working with commission or a large-scale work that I know where it's going. The amount of resources it takes to create a piece that size is such that I'm not investing my own money in making something of that scale. Now, I do have some larger works that are in my studio that will go to different exhibitions and things like that. But some of the large-scale work that I've done recently has been commissioned by institutions. Yeah.
What would you say has been a particular highlight or rewarding opportunity or experience in your art career?
So I have not had a day job for the last 13 years, which does not mean that I am always solvent at all. But it just, when I had children and then I quit my arts administration job, which I loved, at the John Michael Kohler Arts Center in Kohler, Wisconsin, because I had to be a mother and I had to be an artist. So that was the only thing that I could decide to cut out. And I've managed to cobble together enough commercial success to continue as a practicing visual artist for the last 13 years. That's not to say that I am not willing to go out and get another job if I need to. I absolutely will. And I actually find it really engaging to work in administration or do something else. So I'm okay with that. But I would say that just the ability to continue to make work that is pushing my work forward and be able to go into the studio every day is so amazing. I'm also very fortunate. I've gotten a lot of recognition for what I've done, and I wouldn't even know where to begin to say thank you to all of the people that believed in that work. For me, it's like, wow, I can't believe I'm going into my studio again today. Like, even if I'm broke or I'm flush or whatever it is, I'm able to go in and do something that is really, really interesting for me. Not phone it in, but actually do something that moves the needle forward, you know?
Have you ever had a moment where you think, this is it, I've made it?
That moment lasts for like a very short period of time after a major recognition. And then I'm like looking to the next moment, right? I'm looking for the next, not necessarily the next recognition, but the next big thing. I think that this world is just so fickle and fleeting. And I'm really hyper aware that what is resonating to our world, to the population at large, mass culture, etc., that changes like every 6 months or whatever, you know, and that's not our job as artists to bend to that, to bend to the trend of the moment or to speak to the present moment other than being true to yourself in your work, right? But I'm hyper aware that whatever kind of recognition for whatever I happen to be doing, it's such a gift, right? It's such a gift because the communication could slip in 5 years or a year from now, and I could be doing my thing and people are going to be looking in the opposite direction. So I think you have to be really solid in what's driving you and just keep that focus, right?
What's a hard truth you've had to learn?
When I graduated from college, I found it dismaying that really no one cared whether I would ever make anything ever again. It was just like, no one cares. I know you're nodding your head. Everyone, she's nodding her head. But I mean, there's so many reasons not to make anything at all. So many good, valid reasons. Academia is just it's a sacred space in that whether you're getting the feedback you want or not, people are still showing up and witnessing what you're doing, and they've drunk the Kool-Aid. They're there because they believe in the system. And when you leave school, you could literally walk quietly into the night and never do anything again, and no one would care, and it would not really matter. I find that liberating now, but at the time, it was hard.
Yeah. How did you push yourself to do stuff?
I just had an internal drive that I wanted to prove to myself that I could maintain a studio practice after being in school for so long. That's why I didn't go back to school, actually, is I wanted to prove to myself that I could just have a consistent studio practice for myself after having been in school for nearly 6 years or whatever. So, and then I developed a rhythm.
Yeah.
And then I didn't want to break the rhythm out to go back into school. Once I got it, I wanted to stay in it.
Man, I hear ya. I thought for quite a while after finishing university that maybe I'm not a real artist because I'm not spending every waking moment making art.
I hear you.
And it took me a while to figure that out.
You need the fallow time to regenerate.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do. I don't want to speak for other people, but you need the time. Even when I'm doing like the smaller things in my studio, it's just like a way to keep the hands going to a certain extent. We're really, here's a quote for you, full circle. I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember it, but Eva Hesse said, I think, towards the end of her life in her diary, she said, I don't have to justify my life through making art. Total paraphrase, and someone can definitely correct me. Someone's going to phone in, and we're not phoning in, but you know what I mean.
The phones are ringing off the
Yeah,
book.
the phones are ringing. Yeah. And I mean, that was liberating to read that.
I love that. What's some advice you would give an artist who's thinking about maybe collaborating with a glass artist or experimenting with glass art?
Keep an open mind and be open to what's possible, but don't limit yourself to what you think is possible. And find someone who really understands who you are and how you make something. It'll make it easier.
Beth, what are you working on right now, and what have you got coming up in the near future?
So right now I have a piece I'm very proud of that's on view at the Toledo Museum of Art. It's called Regift, and it will be on view until January 2025. I am working on a hanging permanent installation for the Muskegon Museum of Art in Michigan that will be installed at some point this fall. And I am in the middle of fabricating a permanent outdoor work for Iowa State University called Hive Mind that will be in bronze and glass and will be on view starting April of 2025.
Great. Sounds like you're busy.
Right now, yes. Yep.
Do you have a dream project that you haven't been able to realize yet?
It's my next project. Anastasia. It's my next project. Yep. Whatever the project
Sounds
is.
about right.
Right? Yep.
That's the correct answer.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, well, tell me, where can people find out more about your work? Maybe buy your work, find you?
Yes. People can find me on my website, which is just my name, bethlipman.com. I am also on Artsy. I am represented by Nora Jaime Gallery in New York, Leslie Farron in Western Massachusetts, East Coast of the United States, Katie Tompkins Projects in Providence, Rhode Island, and Mark Moore Gallery, which is actually virtual now, but he's based in California. And IG is Beth_Lipman_artist. Yeah.
I'll put all of those links in the show notes so people can check it out, easily find you, go follow you. It's definitely worth going on Beth's website and looking at the amazing images.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and getting to know you a bit more. Maybe we'll meet in person one day. Who knows? I hope so. I'd love to see your work in person.
Please come visit. This has really been my pleasure. And I think your work is just spectacular. I think the podcast is incredibly interesting, relevant. Now that I know about it, I am going to listen to every single episode. So it's really great to be connected. Thank you so much.
Thanks. That was Beth Lipman, based in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin. You can find out more about her work on her website, bethlipman.com. That's BETHLIPMAN.com, and on her Instagram at Beth_Lipman_artist. If you're in Ohio, you can go see her installation in person right now at the Toledo Museum of Art until September 1st, 2024. All the links are in the show notes, as well as on our website, installationartpodcast.com. If you like this podcast, the best way to show your support and to help us grow is by leaving a 5-star review wherever you're listening. This helps our rating and it helps other people find the show. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.